Are you ready for an open discussion with the best of the best and the best of what's next? Welcome to the Tony DUrso Show. Join in on a great conversation today with some of the world's great influencers as they showcase great advice and techniques that made them the game changers they are today. Now, here's Tony DUrso.
Welcome, I'm your host, Tony DUrso, and it's good to have you with us today. And maybe this episode will hit closer to home to help you out. If this resonates with you, and I really do hope it does, please share this with your friends too. This is all about helping you and your friends turn your vision into reality. Today, we're going to discuss winning in your category with Dan Granger. Now, you're listening right now because you want to scale up your business. You want to learn some great marketing tactics, or you're planning to start something great. Maybe you want to hack that day job of yours and turn your custom watch design into a six-figure income maker, something like that. Am I right so far? So basically, you want to win in your category. And what is winning? As we spoke in a recent episode with Bree Seeley, it's about getting the equivalent of the bronze, silver, or gold medal. But, you know, in the Olympics, there's thousands and thousands of people they try out in their country and they get selected, and only a few select move on to the big game or games. But the difference in the business world, in life, every person listening to this, and that's you can develop a sustainable business and win in your category. Now, with recent guests, we've given a lot of tips and advice in this area. So let's put it all together here for you. Meet Dan Granger. Dan Granger is founder and CEO of Oxford Road. It's the leading independent audio agency in the U.S. They've helped hundreds of direct-to-consumer companies scale their efforts in audio using podcast, radio, streaming, connected voice, and more. Let's find out more and drill into this. Hi, Dan. Welcome to the Tony DUrso Show.
Hi, Tony. Great to be here.
Dan, the honor is all mine, and we're all looking forward to learning more about winning in our category. And we have a lot of questions about this. And just before we get into it, would love to know about your backstory and how did it all start for you?
Sure. So I got out of school and had moved to California to go to college. Got the entertainment bug like a lot of people. It's hard to be in LA County and not get pulled in. And I started working for a company that made documentaries for the History Channel. And I love history, but I wasn't learning any history. And I was dealing with license agreements and sitting in traffic most of the day, running tapes around town. And while I was doing that, I started turning on different formats. I got sick of hearing the same songs on the radio over and over again. So I tried the AM dial and started learning about spoken word. And I found that it opened my eyes and my mind to different perspectives that I hadn't heard before. And I liked the debate, the banter, the in-depth conversation that audio allowed for that I didn't feel like other media types could compete with. So there was an awakening there for me. And I saw some people that were very successful in sales, and I didn't want to just sell to sell. But I thought, well, if there was something that I was really passionate about, and I could sell that, maybe I'd be really successful and enjoy my life. And so I was passionate about spoken word audio and found out you could sell it. And there's so much autonomy that comes with that world, being able to manage client relationships, write ad copy, being able to manage the campaigns and measure the impact that it has on a business. I thought that was all very, very exciting. So I started working for what is now iHeartMedia, what at the time was Clear Channel Radio in 2003. Did that for about 10 years. And over the time that I was there, one of the things I found that was missing in the industry was the ability to go deeper than some kind of big boxes of genres. In other words, you know, when you turn on a radio station, there's formats, right? There's a Kiss FM in most markets. There might be a country, a classical, but they're really only skimming the surface of what is possible within those genres. And when you go to spoken word, it's the same issue. You might be talking about presidential politics. You might be talking about immigration. There's a list of topics that they talk about, And, what the internet was starting to prove at that time in the early 2000s was that you could really fan out and get specific and find communities that had common interests that went deeper than just these big tent pole topics that most of the industry was predicated on. And so, look, I grew up in Michigan. First half of my life was there. And if you study Henry Ford, you learn that not only most of us know he didn't actually invent the automobile, but the interesting thing is he gets credited for the assembly line. Well, he didn't really invent that either. He went to Chicago and saw meatpacking plants where they had animal carcasses on hooks that could rotate around to different stations, and said, I'm going to adopt that model because I see a parallel business and apply that over to my field. And he did that to great effect. Well, what I was able to observe was things like the advent of the blogosphere and the idea that everybody now had a website. People started doing newsletters, people started doing blog posts, and you could get really, really in depth about things that were never possible to build communities around before. Things that, whatever your particular interest in, you could go very, very deep. And so, for example, Tony, your show is a perfect example because you're dealing with entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs. And in reality, this could never be a Monday through Friday drive time, 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. program. And yet there are millions and millions and millions of people in this country that want this type of content, but they couldn't do that when they were limited by just a few presets in their car. So podcast allowed the industry to fan out and to go in all of these subgenres, and where you could find affinity groups and they could have a common place to meet without being limited by an AM or an FM signal. And communities started rising up around these clusters of interest. And so we saw that happening early. And I started kicking the tires on the industry around 2006, made a proposal to my employer at the time called Talk Radio 2.0, and kind of forecasted Pandora just started. These podcasts are starting to happen. I think there's going to be a big movement in this direction. The reality is that they were too big to care, and the industry was too small to notice at that time. So went about my business for a few years, and got to really cut my teeth in working with direct-to-consumer tech brands. I started taking trips. I wear a suit. I don't wear a suit much anymore. I'm a little dressed up for you, Tony, but typically we don't wear suits anymore, right? But at the time, I'd wear the suit and tie, and I'd take my trips up to the Silicon Valley, and I'd try to, walk in on a business, and they didn't operate that way at all. They were, it was a softer touch, and they really didn't want to talk about the benefits of audio media. What they wanted to hear about was metrics and analytics, and how do you know that it's working? And I learned the language of the tech industry because at that time, we're probably talking 2005 to 2010, there was a real language barrier. And the companies that had survived the dot-com boom or been and bust or had been created after it, they had accountability that we had never seen before. And so I learned the language of that type of accountability. I feel like all advertising is always kind of based on a central agreement that the advertiser says, what's the least we can spend to try something? And if it works, we'll spend more. And I think, now when you become a big brand, you have a longer time horizon, but it's essentially the same question. How do you do something that's going to work? How do you measure it? How do you expand what's working? And so I really got to learn and build a team to work with me on this and incubate what became Oxford Road inside of Clear Channel, working with tech companies that were very afraid and didn't really understand channels like radio, and give them the opportunity to do it. Well, there were two waves cresting at the same time, and one was the direct-to-consumer wave. So, for example, we got to do the first podcast deal with Dollar Shave Club. And you got to remember, like 2013, it was novel that you could ship somebody razor blades in the mail, right? Like that was disruptive at the time. That was a big deal. And then you had these consumers of media like podcast. They were early adopters too. They didn't have the opportunity to hear what they wanted, wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted. They had to work hard to get to that content. And so they were early adopters using early adopter products. And so it was a match made in heaven because the ads performed really well. So I started with a little side hustle where some of us would go into a conference room and make calls to, the Mark Marons of the world and their managers. They didn't have all these networks. And we built a web of relationships that we could take some radio advertisers that wanted to expand into new channels and put them on podcasts with great success. So the convergence of the direct-to-consumer revolution and the podcast revolution caused us to have a little side hustle that became a large business very quickly. And we were able to open our doors on good terms with my previous employer, Clear Channel, and also a full book of business. And so in 2013, we started Oxford Road, and we're off to the races, grew very, very quickly. We got into the Inc. 500, which is cool. But what was even cooler was they measure your growth on a 3-year period. We achieved what it takes 3 years for most companies to do to get in the 500. We did that in 2 years. No outside funding, no help from really any institutions. We did this thing on our own. And I'm proud to say I'm still working with a lot of the same people that we kicked this off with. It's great.
We're talking with Dan Granger about winning in your category, and you can find out more at oxfordroad.com. We know how to spell that, OXFORDROAD.com. Dan, it is quite an amazing story of how, and I want to drill a little bit into why Oxford Road and what makes it so different. It's like podcasts, we know that, and radio, we know that, but why are you so different? And then we want to kind of go into the media landscape a little bit, but let's just start there on what makes you so different.
Well, I think the answer to that question evolves. At the beginning, I think a lot of it was we were really kind of the only game in town. I mean, there were some agencies that still exist today that were starting to transition from being radio agencies or endorsement radio specialists into the podcast space. But I think we were the first ones to come out and say, no, this is the primary and everything else is secondary. And I think that gave us an early mover advantage for sure. And then being able to develop some expertise in areas that I think are lacking. For example, we have a program called Audiolytics. It's proprietary to Oxford Road that actually allows us to break down ad or any really persuasive device using words and to look at the structure of it and say, okay, how does it fit against 9 key components and 71 subcomponents? And what are the values of those components? And allows us to score ad creative and make optimizations to ad creative to maximum effect. So when we start a campaign, we've done so much QC on the ad copy by itself that a lot of times our ads will last years and years and years, and it becomes very, very hard to beat the first one that we ever go to market with because we're so rigorous in the process of developing it. That's one example. I think what that points up to, it all kind of ladders up to this idea of like a checklist manifesto, and the idea that I think we've probably created the most robust list of critical things that need to underpin a successful campaign, whether that's in media for the planning, which is more than rate negotiation, even though that's important. There's a lot to flighting, scheduling, unit lengths, frequency. These are really important components that we pay attention to and have a rigorous approach that we can actually use metrics and numbers to hold ourselves accountable to. Things like attribution, figuring out where the response to your ads came from. And that takes a lot of work. That marketplace continues to evolve, but we have a compliance process to make sure that the clients we work with have checked a number of boxes and completed a number of steps so that we know that we'll have the best chance in the market to be successful. And then, the 3 M's, media, measurement, messaging, these are the 3 legs of the marketing stool. And so Audiolytics is a big part of that. And then the other part of it is working with hosts like you, Tony, when we go to market to to launch a campaign, we want the hosts to be as engaged as they're willing to be with the brand so that they can actually make that authentic firsthand recommendation and tell the story in their own voice. There's an art and a science to ad creative, particularly in our field. The science is more audiolytics. That's the structure. So that there's the right framework and components in the message that we're going to hand to you. But when you receive it as the talent, we want to make sure that you can make that your own and style it in the way that only you can with your own unique story and connection to the brand. So, what makes Oxford Road different historically? I think the fact that we were early. I think the fact that we established expertise in audio with podcast being our signature dish. But I also think it's the fact that we've been OCD to an extent. We've been rigorous in creating, defining, operating against protocols and processes that ensure maximum viable scale and best in market performance for our clients, which is part of our mission statement.
That is quite something. So but there's more to Oxford Road than just being early. And I from what I understand, it's because a lot of companies, let's say mid-sized companies, will just go, so much on magazines, so much billboard, so much radio, so much podcast.
Sure.
But you have a bigger or a nice, how do I put it? A nice, good area for the media landscape that you do advertise, and you're so in tune to the metrics, which is really tough. Ask a lot of podcasters how well their shows are listened to and the demographics. It has been a tough point. Who's my audience? Where are they? How long do they listen? These are questions. There's ways to get around it, but there's costs and there's more technology involved. But you've gotten around a bit of this. I don't mean around. You've tackled and solved this for your large advertisers, sponsors that work with you, in being able to give them the metrics that are what they need to see that their ad is performing. Because you see something out on the billboard or on TV, you don't necessarily know in the old days what it was doing. You just know, well, my phone has rung more times, today it's very, very different. And I'd like to know how far you've taken that down in terms of being able to see where you're getting the best bang for the buck, so to speak, and where you're getting the best results on your
Absolutely.
advertising.
Okay, so great question. And without going down the attribution rabbit hole and talking, pixel-based attribution versus surveys and promo codes and all that, let's just agree that we have best-in-class methodologies, and sometimes we work with third parties so that we know how every program that we buy performs. All right. We have hundreds of millions of dollars of historical performance data on thousands of different programs and channels that we've accumulated over the years. Now, what we've been able to do is tag it, normalize it, and express it back to ourselves in a way that it doesn't just help when you're talking to a client and going, here's the performance we saw by program, here's how we're going to optimize. That's part of the work. But behind the scenes in our planning process, what we've been able to do is say, okay, you are brand X. We have worked with, half a dozen brands that reach a similar target, that have similar goals, maybe similar KPIs or pricing points. And we're going to look at the top performing assets for each of those other advertisers that that are really in your comp set. And we're going to paint by numbers and go from the top down using our performance data and knowing that, hey, look, this show Y was an average of 5x better than it needed to be across 7 different brands that were like the one that we're placing for. Well, guess what? The math and the analytics is going to inform that media plan better than anything Nielsen can give you. And so that is definitely a part of the secret sauce. Being able to have case studies or a database of data, performance data, and being able to correlate that and project it forward for other brands. Nothing predicts success like past success. And we have the information to be able to use that with every plan that we make. And so we try to do that.
Dan, I like to look at this from a non-biased, maybe a little humble approach. Are podcasts really as good as we think they are in terms of advertising with them? We have a lot of podcasters in the audience as well.
Sure.
How do we stand? How do we or how do podcasts stand up to radio and these other forms of advertising?
Sure. Look, every channel has its advantages. I think that you've got a bit of a gold rush still going on in podcast. Word has spread, and you're seeing a lot of money flow into the business in the last couple of years. Of course, a lot of M&A. So, when does it overheat? I don't know. I don't think we're quite there yet. But look, I do think it has natural advantages. For example, what we talked about was, radio is an intimate channel, and you can paint pictures with words and you can connect with people more deeply. And it's not so soundbite driven. You turn on cable or, a lot of what you see on television, it's got to move real fast, and you can go an inch deep and a mile wide. It's like Twitter in a way. A lot of online content is like that. You get short thoughts, and if you want to go deep, you have to read an article. Well, we're like the articles. We're like the magazines, right? Like where you can really connect and break down a problem and workshop it and talk about the different sides of it and have a human connection and I think an empathy for each other that is really hard to produce when you're bound to a time clock, when you've only got 30 minutes, when you've got to have a ton of commercial breaks in the middle of it. I just think that audio is perhaps the most intimate media channel. And I've always believed that. So I got into that because I believed it as a consumer. But I think that podcast, half of its advantages are organic. The other half are going to go away because, listen, they've all been, most of the impressions that occur in the podcast medium are now owned by large corporations who at some point are going to have to make good on their investment. When they buy a network for $300 million, they're going to have to show a return. That means more ad units. That means more produced ads. That means less risk. You're bringing in, now you're courting big Madison Avenue brands. And, we work with all sizes of companies, but the bigger the company, the less they want to see you be a maverick in your content. But who built the podcast ecosystem? Mavericks. People that were willing to go against the grain. That starts to go away. And so I do think over time we lose our edge a little. And I think we become a compromise with what was radio. But I certainly think that it has advantages. I know we'll get a chance to talk a little bit about brand safety and polarization and some of the challenges of combining user-generated content with the spoken word and giving everybody access to that with no filters and oversight. I think this is how the West was won. It starts out with a great opportunity for the people that move early if you don't get killed. And then eventually you go, well, they're running out of gold, but we can still sell these guys picks and shovels. And, I think that you start to see infrastructure coming into the space in ways that you didn't see before. And I think we just have to accept that that's the natural progression of things and be excited for the incremental progress that we've made and that will sustain in the industry.
And what about, there are some controversial outlets in all of this. What about that in terms of advertising and bringing on advertising? There's dangers, there's risks. Can you comment on that?
Absolutely. Everything you do or who you are is going to bother somebody. It's all going to offend somebody. And I think we have found that everybody's a journalist now. Everybody's got a microphone. You and I have shows because we decided to have shows, right? And social media, I think, is the easy example of all this. What happens when you turn on everybody's mic at the same time and you don't have anybody moderating the conversation? It gets messy real fast. And so in the same way that, Facebook has misinformation problems, it has hate problems. And the more polarizing a statement you make, the more attention it draws. We've known for a long time, if it bleeds, it leads, right? We'll extrapolate on that for every type of media with no FCC governance on the internet. And the floodgates are open, and we're all living through that time. It's a very interesting time in human history. Well, in our world, in audio, it's even harder because, you can't really at this stage do like keyword blocking or things like that. You and I are going to have a conversation for, 40, 50 minutes. And that conversation, I could say anything right now. We could do this whole thing on our cell phones and post it immediately, slap a couple ads on it. They'd never know what they were getting themselves into. And so, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a real challenge. And when you take the idea that you can now say anything, whether it's legal, hurtful, harmful, or just easily misunderstood, and people are as sensitive as they've ever been, and they have the ability to express their outrage or their disappointment or their opinions about what you've said or what you think in public forums in a way that, in the old days, you could do a letter writing campaign, but the only person that was going to see it is the recipient. Now you get to publicly shame people at scale. And so we're in a very peculiar time and space. And I think it affects all media in big ways. But I think it is an elevated challenge in audio where there is so much content to manage. Think about how many words are spoken, 180 words per minute, say, in every piece of content that you might put out a couple times a week, once a day. That's going on for an hour. That's a lot to monitor, and there's no proofing before you traffic the ads, and now advertisers can get pulled into the crosshairs of any group for any reason, fair or unfair. And I see both of those things happening frequently and at a frequency we've never seen before.
And we also see it on the podcast host, the radio host. I've seen some, their whole career gets ruined because they said something incorrect, improper, or inappropriate that just kind of came
Right.
out, or even a guest, and all of a sudden, boom. So we're always very curious or very concerned about that and curious about our guests. And we go, we all run through the gauntlet. And I think that's a good reason to record and pre-record shows just to be safe.
Well, and you do the best you can, right? You do the best you can, but at the end of the day, you still don't know what I'm going to say while I'm your guest. I might say something and you didn't even hear it. I might said something that's a dog whistle that totally went by you, or I might have done something in the past that your listeners have a problem with. You can't prevent all of it, right? So I think we're all living in a world of elevated risk. And so that's a problem that we've been working very, very hard on, because I'm not happy. I have not been satisfied with the solutions that have been brought forth to date.
Dan, what do you think is a winning strategy in this arena for all us entrepreneurs and business owners?
Well, it's multi-pronged for sure. I think there are maybe some fundamental tips, and then I think there are some processes, and I can talk you through a little bit what we're doing at Oxford Road on behalf of the brands that we represent. We're representing brands that go from, Series A startups to, $100+ billion valuations. And so we run the gamut. We do see some common themes. Things get more sensitive the larger your business is, of course. But one of the things you have to just remember at the beginning is that you can't have 100% brand safety and do anything. You have to absorb some amount of risk, and people don't want to accept that, but it's true. So part one is like, you're going to get out of bed today. You're probably going to hurt somebody's feelings and offend somebody if people are paying attention to what you're doing, if your work is consequential. So that's like part one. Part two is, I think, about like taking inventory of what are your values? What do you really believe? I think the first phase of Oxford Road as a business was about figuring out how to have like the fastest car, so that if you hit the gas, we can accelerate faster, we can go faster for longer than the others. But the next phase that we're really working on right now is about putting in the steering wheel. so that you can navigate according to your values in a more controlled way. A lot of people don't know what their values are, but I think there's been a big movement in the business community toward this notion of stakeholder capitalism and the idea that we can do well by doing good, that profits and people are not mutually exclusive ideas, and there is such a thing as a win-win. I think a lot of people are starting to believe that. A lot of people say it. I think many of them may even believe it. And so you're seeing companies want to move toward having values and living out those values in the way that they work and the people that they do business with. And if you look at the studies on just the trust in America is a fascinating subject, because what's happened in the last few years and decades is that trust for institutions like the government, like the media, even nonprofits, the Edelman surveys that keep going out keep telling us it's plummeting. People don't see these institutions as ethical, or they don't see them as competent. And in the case of the media and in the case of the government, they're seen as both unethical and incompetent. You know who people trust? They trust business right now. They trust corporations. They trust their employer to give them more accurate news and information than they do media. What do you do in that environment? And are we even qualified for that in the business community? I don't know, but let's accept the premise that here we are. The world has changed, and corporations have a new set of responsibilities where people want to work for a company that has values that align with their own. And then sometimes they want the companies that they paid, that they buy products and services from. They want to know what they believe about, in some cases, things like Georgia voting, or, what are you doing for the environment? They are asking these questions now. They're increasingly important. So that's the reality that we live in. Like, now the question is, what do you do about that? Okay. So step one, as I talked about, it's figuring out what you actually, what are the hills you're going to die on? You can't, what some companies did in 2020 foolishly was they started raising their hand on too much and getting over their skis in terms of their capacity to really not, we start all talking about virtue signaling, right? Just because you put something on your Instagram doesn't mean you're really ready to walk the walk. And people started calling that out, and they're being held accountable for the promises that they made in corporate America. And they should be held accountable. You have to be very careful what promises you make to your stakeholders. And just because you can't make a promise doesn't mean you don't care. It just means you have limited energy, limited resources, limited bandwidth, and you need to decide. You need to be decisive about what issues you care about. So I'll give you an example. Oxford Road, what issue I'm concerned about is polarization, because I feel like the company is ripping apart. People are more in favor of secession than they have probably been since the Civil War. Okay, and media is playing a big part in that. We have an outrage industrial complex. By the way, card-carrying participant in supporting that complex. I have been a facilitator of that by putting sponsor dollars on shows that may have had good intentions, but ended up exploiting our differences. They do it on the right, they do it on the left. What we're working on now through our efforts with the Media Roundtable, which is both podcast and movement, is we're trying to highlight content and provide ratings information based on values and based on how polarizing content can be. We're trying to help people understand what shows are being made that are edifying, that build people up and bring them together, and what type of content is out there that is doing more harm than good, that is pulling people apart, even if they have good intentions. There's a lot of finger pointing and a lot of people believing that the other guys are bad, we're good. I reject that premise. I don't think that's healthy. And I don't think it's healthy for the clients that we represent to be unknowingly going into content and supporting content that is divisive, whichever side of the political spectrum it's on. We're very, very polarized. And so we are starting with Oxford Road now doing things like partnering with groups like the National Institute for Civil Discourse, the Cambridge Negotiation Institute, We have partnered with Adfontes Media, they're the creators of the media bias chart. They actually have independent auditors that go through a rigorous process of evaluating content. We were actually able to partner with them to create the media bias chart for podcasts so that we can make sure that when an advertiser goes into the space, that there is a way that they can find out how far right or left is what I'm sponsoring and how does that line up with my values? How reliable is this information? Is there misinformation or is this a trustworthy source? We are now introducing capabilities so that advertisers can plan not just based on demographics, but also based on values, and that their brand is going to be not only they can hold their heads high, not just because of what they say in their ads, but also because of the content that they're adjacent to. So being able to know where you stand is step one. Being able to recruit tools and resources to even decode the marketplace to know what content aligns with those values is step two. And that's something that at Oxford Road we're working very, very hard on. And then there's the expectation management piece, what we talked about before, knowing that before you get in the arena, know that you're going to get hit at some point if you're successful. If you're actually competing, people are going to, you can't block every accusation that's going to come your way, or every guilt by association that somebody might want to pronounce on you on Twitter because you happen to sponsor a show that they had a problem with, fairly or unfairly. That's part of it. And then part of it is about, okay, you got the email. You found out that, hey, there was an issue with this program, or they said something stupid today, or they said something today that might not have been stupid, but it sounded stupid and it sounded offensive and it sounded hurtful. The line between perception and reality can get very blurry in these cases. And we have step-by-step protocols so that people cannot go to the nuclear option so fast. Because what we saw happening was that in 2020, a lot of the brands that we deal with started getting thrown under the bus on social media or from employees within the organization saying, hey, you're affiliating with this content and I find this content problematic for the following reasons. And then the shows would go, cancel this right away. Well, this is not as robotic as many would like to believe. It's not like you're just buying an ad. You're doing business with Tony DUrso. There's a human being on the other side of this that we have built a relationship with on your behalf. And we want to give them their day in court. We want a due process. So we may want to pause our campaign, but we want to have the ability to have a step-by-step process that we can go through that allows brands to truly investigate what was being said about the program that they're in partnership with, and have more ideas for how to resolve if there's an issue than just cancel immediately and never go there again. There's other ways to address issues, and we want to be more creative than that and keep relationships intact and have more patience and have more due diligence and have due process before you just decide to cancel something because somebody said something on social media without any oversight. So long-winded, but that's a brief picture of what we're doing for the clients that we have. The last thing I'll bring up, and we can go as deep as you want or don't in this, but we also started a podcast that is called the Media Roundtable, and it has also been evolving over the last year and a half. And where we've kind of evolved too, most of the energy historically was talking to people on the right, on the left, people in journalism, people that run networks, people on platforms. We had Newt Gingrich on, we had Carly Fiorina on, we had all these different voices from all sides of the political spectrum. And we tried to understand, how did we get so polarized and what part does media play? And I think we got a good handle on that. I think we got a good understanding. I learned a lot. I think the people that listened and worked on it did as well. But then we had tried to figure out, okay, now what do we do? And so what we do now is we feature a different host every week, and we help. So the notion is, if you're thinking of listening to a show or you're thinking of sponsoring a show, I want a listener or a sponsor to be able to have the conversation that I have with them as a way to get to know the content and not just know what it's about, but know why do they do it? What is the motivation? And what are you doing to help or to hurt the state of people in this country? Because, like I said, a lot of people are driving us apart. We want to encourage the marketplace to support content that's bringing people together and achieves the business goals. That's the mission that we're on.
Dan, I'm a business owner and I'm listening to this show. I've got my problems. I've got my issues. I'm trying to scale. I've got the world's falling apart madness to deal with. I have all this, and I'm listening to this show and I'm thinking, what's the takeaways? What do I want to make sure that I look at to help my business? What are some key factors to glean from your amazing growth and experience so that whether I'm placing ads or I podcast, I just want to get any other nuggets or advice, wisdom, guidance, anything that you can offer to our entrepreneur audience?
The reality is most of the advice that we need, we already know. But let me reiterate some things that I think we already know about each other and ourselves and the world. No pain, no gain. You have to get in the arena and you have to participate. But media is not as mystical as it might seem to some. When you think about the idea that the marketplace today allows you to build an unlimited amount of partnerships with human beings that have an unlimited number of relationships with people, and that you can build a team of ambassadors for your brand who are going to introduce what you do to their audience. That's a phenomenon. And that's podcast is not the only place to do it, but I think when you line up the influence factor, at least today, the way pricing is, I think it's the best game, and I think it's the best channel in the marketplace for what we're trying to achieve. Measurable performance, at scale, is what podcast is providing. So, hopefully, if you're listening to this, you're understanding, like, I want to build relationships with people that have relationships with audiences that they trust, because they will take that trust and they will recommend to people who trust them to also trust the business that you're running if you have a business worth trusting. That's one. Two is, like we talked about, values are a thing. And if you've been profit focused, but not thinking about the impact of your profits on people, I think that way of thinking is going extinct. I think you have to embrace where the world is at and where it's moving to. It doesn't mean you have to get crazy. You do have a business to run. And let me tell you, the bottom line still matters. So don't let anybody push you off of the fundamentals of growing your top line and having a healthy bottom line. That is never going to change. But you can't do it by any means necessary. If you could before, that's not a sustainable plan for you. And so getting really clear and honest about not the values you think people want you to have, but who are you and what do you really believe and what's helpful to people, and how can your business directly correlate to outcomes that benefit the people who work for you, the people who may have invested with you, but your customers and the people in the communities of your customers. How do you leave the place better than you found it? That's a big piece of this. And if you can know that, you can actually make decisions that don't feel reactive or don't feel like you're just following a trend and going, look, I'm a woke corporation. That's not authentic. That's not what people believe. But do they want a values, purpose-driven company that's really making a measurable difference in the marketplace? Of course they do. People want to follow that. And so know what you believe and then follow that. And don't forget the business fundamentals, because those still count. And if you want to talk about using podcasts as a way to do it, you're listening to a show that you can sponsor. If you want a partner to help you try to figure that out, we're happy to talk.
I like that very much. You've expanded my own knowledge on the media, the game, the opportunities, its strengths, its weaknesses, a whole lot more. I really appreciate it. And once again, we spoke about Winning in Your Category with Dan Granger, and you can find out more about all of about Oxford Road and Dan at oxfordroad.com. Dan, I want to thank you so much. It really has opened me up, and I hope it helps a lot of our entrepreneurs in the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for hanging out with me while I featured an elite entrepreneur who took his vision to reality. This was an intriguing interview about my favorite subject, winning in your category with Dan Granger. We talked about so many things, and in no particular order, we discussed today's media landscape. And we talked about good places to advertise. And from a non biased point of view, we talked about podcasts. Are they as good as we think they are in terms of advertising with them? And we compared radio with podcasting. And then we talked about, well, what goes wrong with brands that advertise in controversial outlets, aside, well, from the possibility of getting canceled when something is said incorrect or inappropriate on a show, how that may reflect back on the sponsor or the host or the guest. We've seen this boomerang. We've seen different things happen. We've seen wrong things happen. And we kind of have to be very careful sometimes and make sure we're politically correct. I try very hard to do that. I like to always give a good look and be not really down the middle, but just really good, fair representation, and just take a look at what are good and best practices that we consider to help us in our business. We talked about, well, winning strategy in this arena for entrepreneurs. You know, what should we do and how? Dan brought up some very good points right at the end here, and I really, really liked it. It really sums it up very nicely. And he talked about his podcast, the Media Roundtable. We talked about how it serves the marketplace. And we also threw in some stuff about, which I just mentioned earlier too. We talked about the brand safety, suitability. But I'd like to know, what did you get out of this? What resonates the most with you? Please let us know. And thank you so much for spending some time with us. Let's help you move on your journey to success. Thanks, and remember, success awaits those who persevere and remain steadfast despite the odds. Sow good seeds, do good deeds, and join me on the next episode of The Tony DUrso Show.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's edition of the Tony DUrso Show with his key influencers. Be sure to tune in again next Friday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Time on the Voice America Influencers channel.